John chapter 9. John chapter 9, verses 13 to 34. They brought him, who formerly was blind, to the Pharisees. Now it was Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. They said to the blind man again, What do you say about him, because he opened your eyes? And he said, He is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, He is of age, ask him. So they again called the man who was born blind and said to him, Give God the glory, we know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. And then they said to him again, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this Pharaoh, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, Why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from. Yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, You were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us? And they cast him out.
What a lovely, lovely account is this. Marvellous, isn't it? I'm being a bit ambitious, thinking I can get to verse 34. We'll see how we go. If not, it doesn't matter, we can pick it up this evening. As you remember last week, we looked at this wonderful healing where Jesus appeared to be passing this man by, and as we said, nothing is coincidence, nothing's by chance. Jesus wasn't passing by, Jesus was deliberately walking by. And we have this question, who has sinned for this man to be blind? Is it parents? Is it him? And Jesus said, you've got it completely wrong. This has nothing to do with sin. This is so that God's glory will be revealed. And then we had that incredible account where the light of the world, Christ himself, well, he brought light into this man's eyes for the first time ever since he was born. He'd been born blind, never been able to see. Christ spat on the ground, he made the clay, put it on his eyes, he sent him to the pool called Sent. He had to show obedience, and he went and he washed, and he came back seeing. And no doubt, full of joy. He who had been bound by this blindness, this condition that defined his life, he was now set free, seeing. And no doubt rejoicing. Why would you not be rejoicing? And surely his family rejoiced with him. That's such wonderful news. But it quickly takes a turn totally unexpected. Why? Because it happened on the Sabbath. Jesus knew that. Do you remember how we said last week he could have spoken sight to him? In some occasions, he just spoke the word. In other occasions, he wasn't even in the same town. He didn't need to make the clay, but he did. And there was a reason for that. He wanted to draw out this deep error in the thought process that God wouldn't heal you on a Sabbath. He deliberately went out of his way to heal on the Sabbath, to show people that God's heart is bigger than rules and regulations. God's heart is a heart of love. So, because it happened on the Sabbath, because he has been healed for that crime, he now faces questioning. And it's almost as if he's in the dock. That is how it comes across. Instead of this atmosphere of celebration and joy, there becomes this atmosphere of suspicion and fear. I love in verse 13 it says, they brought him who formerly was blind. You see, he's no longer defined by his blindness. He's now known as the man who was formerly blind. And they asked him, how did you receive your sight? And he summed it up in one little phrase. He put clay on my eyes, I washed, and I see. Lovely, isn't it? Just summed it up. That's exactly what happened. You're asking me how this has come about? Well, he couldn't go into all the theology and anything else, could he? But he knew what had happened to him. He could give testimony to his experience. I know he put clay on my eyes. I know that I went and washed. And I know that I can now see. And immediately, just based on that testimony, the Pharisees split. The majority of them turn around and say, well, if he made clay and it's the Sabbath, he can't be from God. And yet there are some of them who, even at this time, there is a ray of light, there is a ray of revelation breaking in. How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Look to see what has happened. A blind man, a man blind from birth, has received his sight. And you're quibbling over the fact that it happened on the Sabbath and a little bit of clay has been made. You're missing the bigger picture. And we're guilty of that sometimes, aren't we? You know, we sometimes struggle because we have preconceived ideas as to how God should and would and will work. And sometimes God is working right under our nose. And we are straining at little minute details because it's not what we would expect. Always allow God to be God. As we've often said, as Martin has said, you can't put him in a box. God doesn't work in your box. God is God. We are his children. He always surprises us. Always surprises us. And I can assure you of this. He is always at work. Whether we acknowledge it and see it or not, he is always at work. So they turn to this blind man. After they've had the confusion amongst themselves, they've got the disagreement, they then turn back to him. And they say, well, what do you think about him? And I quite like this, because what do you think he's going to say about him? This man is a charlatan, a fraud. He stood there before them as the man who has received his sight. He has no doubt where this has come from. Originally, he tells them, he told his neighbours and his family that a man had put clay on his eyes. Now that he is being interrogated, and now he is having to search through his own heart, his own thoughts. And we see throughout this process that as he gives testimony, and as he is faithful to the revelation as he receives it, and as he testifies about what God has done, his understanding of it grows and grows. So now, he doesn't use that term, he's a man. He says, well, I believe he's a prophet. I believe he has come from God. That's really what he's saying. He is giving testimony. He is confirming the fact that he has no doubt that God has touched him through this man, through this prophet, which is his measure of revelation at that time. It's lovely when you have this amazing paradox in the story about the two testimonies and the two people coming at it. You have this sole man who is a poor beggar, who has received a healing from God, and you've got the religious leaders who aren't happy with how it's being done. And he is there in simple faith, knowing exactly what he has received and what God has done for him. And they, in skepticism, are seeking to undermine everything that has happened. It tells us in verse 18 that they didn't believe concerning him that he'd been blind and had received his sight. They undermined his testimony by saying, well, maybe he wasn't blind in the first place then. Isn't it strange how we can justify our unbelief very often? We can justify our skepticism very often by undermining the faith and the joy and the experience of others. Be very, very careful when somebody shares blessing with you, because through your look and your word you can rob them of the blessing. You can start it from them. It's being shared with you. Be very, very careful how you respond in those times. He is declaring a wonderful healing, and they are seeking to snatch it from him, to pull the rug from under his feet. We don't believe you were ever blind in the first place. So how can they prove that he wasn't blind? Who would know? So then somebody else comes into the dock. It's his parents. They ask for them to come forward. And notice what they say to them in verse 19. Again, it's that same skepticism. The spirit that wants to undermine what has happened. They ask them, saying, is this your son who you say was born blind? Notice that. His own parents. Making out that he hasn't been blind all along. That he's been a beggar on the street pretending all his life. And the parents are in cahoots with him around that. What parents would subject their son to a life of begging when he had perfect eyesight? It is an absolutely stupid charge. But they are seeking to make that charge to justify their stance. It's not based on logic, it's not based on evidence. It is based on the fact that they have already decided who Jesus is. And they are trying to find evidence that backs up their conclusion. And again, we need to be so careful when we think we know the outcome before we found out the evidence. So often in life, we think we know all the circumstances, and we really do. And so often we have made a judgment, and we're trying to find reasons to back up our own judgment, instead of coming at it with a very neutral stance, an open heart, an open mind. And even with the things of God, we need to keep an open mind. We need to have a teachable spirit. If our heart is closed, and if our mind is closed, how can he ever get in? So they sought to sow doubt and unbelief around his own testimony. They sought to sow doubt and unbelief around his parents' testimony. And this spirit of skepticism and fear, it works, you know. His parents are robbed. His parents are robbed of the joy of celebrating the healing of their son. And why are they robbed of it? Because they allow that spirit to dominate their thought. They're so afraid. The fear of man. Why are they afraid? Because they know anybody who sides with Christ is going to be put out of the synagogue. That is how bad the opposition has come to this stage. If you side with Christ, you're not welcome here anymore. And the stigma of being thrown out of the synagogue was so strong in those times that they couldn't get over that hurdle. God is able to heal rifts and divisions in families. But how do you think that boy felt when he's there giving testimony to the fact that he's been healed and his own parents won't back him up? They said, oh, we don't know how it happened. That's a lie. They did know. You told them. The Bible tells us they said that because they were afraid. Because they knew if they confessed Christ, they'd be thrown out. And they had a horrible choice to make. And the spirit of man is horrible. And it does force Christians to make terrible choices sometimes. Over denouncing their faith or feeding their families. And this man, his parents are given this horrible choice. Are you going to side with him? And if you do, we'll throw you out. Or are you going to publicly muddy the waters? And he would have heard those words. He would have been there. He would have seen them squirming, trying to get out of the situation that they were in. Don't we pray to God that they'd have the same strength of character as him? And they said, yes, this is our son, and he has been healed. Better be thrown out with your family than to stay there knowing it's a pretense and a lie. We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Again, absolving themselves of any responsibility, taking away the opportunity to support him and stand by his side. It's not always us who are being persecuted, but we have the option to stand with those who do. Physically, financially, prayerfully, we can still stand with those who are being persecuted for their faith. They had a choice, and they made the wrong choice. We understand why, but it's still the wrong choice. They should have stood by their boy. They should have confessed the healing that had been given to him. And verse 22 makes it very clear why they made the wrong choice. Because they feared the Jews. The fear of man is a terrible thing, isn't it? And it can come through so many guises. Some of the songs that we've sung today talk about when I feel the touch. It talks about me. It talks about our relationship with him. And we are here collectively as a body of believers, but we have our own personal experience with him. Let's not look sideways in our worship. Let's look upwards. Let's give him the worship that is due to his name. So through fear, they wouldn't stand. That spirit that sought to sow doubt and unbelief was partially successful. But praise God, he wouldn't budge. It's a lovely, lovely testimony how this poor, blind beggar stands up for what God has done for him and grows stronger and stronger in the doing. They turn around to him in verse 24 and they say something which sounds spiritual. And people can say things to you sometimes and they sound spiritual, but the motive behind it is far from the Spirit of God. It's easy to sound spiritual. You've got to know his will. You've got to know his mind. Give God the glory. Now, isn't that a lovely thing to say? Give God the glory, but they didn't just say that. Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. So they were seeking to sideline Christ. Let's forget how you were healed. Let's just say that God did it then. And that is a compromise. That could have worked for him if he had played their game and given God the glory and allowed them to condemn the means by which he had been saved. To say, well, God has healed me, and yes, I agree with you. This man is a sinner. Stop and think about what they're actually asking him to do. Give God the Father the glory for your healing and call God the Son a sinner. You can't do that. Right throughout the chapters before, we've been looking at the fact that Jesus is making it very clear to them, you cannot have the Father without the Son. I stand here before you as the Son of God, and if you don't accept me, you're rejecting the Father. You cannot now say, well, we'll hold on to the Father, but we'll reject the Son. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. There's no other way. We have to accept him. So again, we see this scheming and their cleverness, but it's wrong. He cannot give God the glory and call Christ a sinner. That is not glorifying God at all. I remind you of the verse we looked at last week, John 8:49. Where they accuse Jesus of having a demon. Again, it's the same spirit coming from the same source. You have a demon. The works that you're doing aren't coming from heaven and God, they're coming from the pit and from the devil himself. And Jesus says to them in verse 49, I do not have a demon. I honour my Father, and you dishonour me. And that's what they're doing here. It's the same spirit. They're dishonouring him. They're seeking to undermine him. What a wonderful answer the man gives in verse 25. You see, they have said, we know this man is a sinner. That's a lie. He's not a sinner at all. Christ challenged them in the chapter before, can you name one thing that I've said or done that is wrong? And they couldn't. And yet now they're condemning him as a sinner, even though they cannot name a sin. You see, they're lying. Remember who he said their father was? The father of all lies. It's a lie. He's not a sinner. They confess to know an untruth. Impossible. That can only be a lie. We know this man is a sinner. And his answer is God-given. Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. You see, he wasn't willing to say that. He didn't know. But I do know one thing. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. He comes back to the evidence that is before him. I know I was blind, and I know I can see. So they start asking him again, how did he do it? Well, he's already told them. But that's what people do when they don't like your answer. Children do it, don't they, all the time? They ask you a question, you give them the answer, it's not the answer they wanted. A few minutes later, they ask you the question again. They're hoping they get a different answer. I told you already, he perceives what's going on. You're asking, but you're not listening. You're asking, but you don't want to know what I think. You want me to tell you what you think. You're not listening. And then, with a bit of irony, he throws a question to them. Do you also want to be his disciples? There's a bit of irony in that, isn't it? But you know what? That invitation, that is exactly what should have happened. When this man was healed and returned with his eyesight, his family and his neighbours rejoiced, and he should have gone into the synagogue and they should have rejoiced with him. This is evidence. They keep asking Christ for signs. He keeps doing them all the time. And they're ignoring the signs that he's doing. And his words to them, are you also wanting to be his disciples? If they had an open heart, there's an opportunity here for them to see who Jesus is. They could have become one of his disciples. And then they throw it back in his face. You are his disciple. It's lovely because I'm not sure if he even knew it himself at this time. But they're right. He is a disciple. He is a follower. He is somebody who is seeking to defend his Saviour. You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. Again, going back to the age-old problem of holding on to the shadow and the type and not seeing the revelation and the fulfillment of what that type is. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. And that is the root problem. They do not know. They claim to know, but they do not know. You have people with natural vision talking to a man who used to be naturally blind. And yet now, they are the blind ones. And he hasn't only got natural vision, he is starting to see spiritually. He is starting to see who Jesus really is. And through this discourse, we see that blindness comes in many forms. He then turns around and he says again, words that cut through to their very heart. Why, this is a marvellous thing. You do not know where he is from, yet he has opened your eyes. What is he saying there? He's saying you don't know where he's from, but the evidence is before you. I'm telling you, he's opened my eyes. Doesn't that give you a hint as to where he is from? And he expounds that. This poor blind beggar is instructing them. God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Surely, you know where he's from. Even if you say you don't know him, we know where he's from because of what he's doing and what he's done. And I know where he's from, and I know what he's done. What lovely boldness God has given him. Not to be cowed, but to stand for what he knows to be true. And whenever we testify to the truth of God, it gives a courage and a strength within our hearts. And so often when we've witnessed, we know that God has been with us, and we feel the stronger for it. What is the outcome of this burst of revelation? Because that's exactly what it is. If they had ears to listen, that should have convinced them. It is based on logic and fact and evidence. But it stings them to the heart. Because if you're not ready to accept truth, truth hurts. You were completely born in sins, and you were teaching us. They go back to the age-old question: if he's a blind beggar, he's a sinner. They don't see themselves as sinners. They see other people as sinners. God forbid that we ever fall into that trap. We are all sinners. Just some of us have had our sins forgiven, and others haven't. But we're all sinners. But they throw that in his face. You are a sinner, and you think you can teach us? Well, if their hearts have been opened, he could have taught them. If their minds had been open to all that was standing in front of them and all that they'd seen and cheered, they could have learned so much. But instead of truth being received and him being accepted, truth is rejected and he is thrown out. They will not tolerate him there. Religion cast him out. Didn't want anything to do with him. A day that had started like every other day, blind begging in the street. A day that had been transformed into the greatest day of his life, and God had given him sight. And then he had come down under this question in this court. But thank God it ends on a high. You might think that's a bit strange, but it does end on a high. We'll have a look at that tonight. Because, yes, man will cast you out, but there is a friend who stands by his side, and he never throws us out.